The stadium fell silent in a way that should have been impossible with 80,000 people inside. Not the expectant silence before a song begins. Not the reverent hush during a ballad. This was different. This was the sound of collective realization, of thousands of people simultaneously understanding that something irreplaceable had just broken in front of them. Jon Bon Jovi stood center stage, microphone still at his lips, his face a mask of controlled devastation. He had just attempted the high note in Livin on a Prayer, the note he had hit flawlessly thousands of times across 4 decades. And his voice had not just cracked, it had disappeared entirely, replaced by a strained rasp that barely registered through the stadium speakers. That was the moment. April 15, 2017. Madison Square Garden, New York. The night 80,000 fans realized Jon Bon Jovi's voice was gone forever. But the story of that night began much earlier. Jon Bon Jovi's voice had been his fortune and his identity for over 35 years. It was not just an instrument. It was the thing that separated him from every other kid in New Jersey who dreamed of escaping through music. His voice had range, power, a raspy emotional quality that could convey both strength and vulnerability. It could fill stadiums without amplification, could sustain notes that other singers could not reach, could perform night after night without seeming to tire. In the 1980s and 90s, Jon's voice was indestructible. He would perform 3-hour concerts, do radio interviews afterward, then hit the recording studio the next morning. His vocal cords seemed immune to the wear that destroyed other rock singers. While contemporaries were canceling tours for vocal rest, Jon was adding dates. The voice was a gift, and like many people with natural gifts, Jon did not fully appreciate how rare it was until it began to fade. The first signs appeared in the early 2000s. Nothing dramatic, just small moments where a high note required slightly more effort, where a sustained passage left him more winded than it should have. Jon noticed, but did not worry. He was in his 40s. Bodies change, voices mature. He adjusted his performance style, worked with vocal coaches, took better care of his instrument. The problems seemed manageable. By 2010, the issues were harder to ignore. Jon's voice had lost some of its upper register. The effortless high notes from his 20s now required preparation and technique. Fans began to notice. Online forums filled with concerned discussions about Jon's vocal decline. Concert reviews mentioned his struggles with certain songs. But Bon Jovi kept touring, kept recording, kept performing the hits that audiences demanded. Jon consulted doctors, specialists, vocal therapists. The diagnosis was consistent and devastating. Vocal cord damage from decades of performing without proper technique or adequate rest. The tissue had scarred. The flexibility was diminished. The power was fading. Some damage was reversible with surgery and therapy, but much of it was permanent. Jon faced a choice. He could have surgery that might restore some vocal function, but required months of complete silence and offered no guarantees of full recovery. Or he could continue performing with his damaged voice, adapting as best he could, knowing that every performance was causing additional wear. Jon chose to keep performing. The band had tour commitments. Fans had bought tickets. The music was who he was. Stopping felt like death. From 2010 to 2017, Jon Bon Jovi performed with a voice that was progressively failing him. He lowered the key on many songs. He let the audience carry more of the vocals. He avoided the highest notes in the original arrangements. It was a slow retreat, a gradual accommodation to diminishing capacity. Loyal fans made excuses. He sounds different, but still good. He's earned the right to age. The songs still work. But everyone could hear what was happening. Jon Bon Jovi's voice was dying in public, one concert at a time. The Madison Square Garden show on April 15, 2017, was supposed to be a triumph. It was part of the "This House Is Not for Sale" tour, a return to form after a period of uncertainty. The album had performed well. The band was energized. Jon had worked extensively with vocal coaches to prepare. He was determined to prove that he could still deliver a world-class performance. The day of the show, Jon woke up in his New York hotel room with a familiar tightness in his throat. Nothing alarming, just the usual sensation before a big show, the feeling he had learned to live with over the past several years. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at his reflection, seeing the face of a man in his mid-50s who had aged well but showed the wear of 3.5 decades on the road. He touched his throat gently, feeling for swelling or pain. Nothing acute, just the chronic discomfort that had become his baseline. He did his vocal warm-ups carefully, running through scales and exercises his coach had prescribed. His speaking voice sounded okay, maybe a little rough around the edges but functional. He drank his special throat tea, the herbal blend that was supposed to reduce inflammation. He took his vitamins, his supplements, all the things that were supposed to protect what remained of his voice. The routine had become elaborate over the years, a series of rituals designed to coax one more performance from a failing instrument. He ran through his pre-show routine with meticulous attention, vocal rest until sound check, light meals to avoid acid reflux, hydration without overdoing it, temperature management in the hotel room, every variable controlled as much as possible. He told himself that tonight would be fine. It had to be fine. This was Madison Square Garden, his home turf, the venue where he had played some of his greatest shows. The audience would give him energy. The adrenaline would carry him through. He had survived worse nights. He could survive this one. Soundcheck that afternoon revealed some strain. The high notes in "You Give Love a Bad Name" were rough. "Wanted Dead or Alive" felt labored. But Jon had experienced worse. He would rely on the energy of the crowd, let adrenaline carry him through the difficult passages. It would be fine. The show began at 8 p.m. Madison Square Garden was packed, every seat filled, the floor section a sea of bodies and raised phones. The opening songs went well enough. Jon's voice was raspy but present. The crowd sang along enthusiastically, their voices helping to mask his limitations. "It's My Life," "Raise Your Hands," "You Give Love a Bad Name." The set list progressed without disaster. Jon felt his voice deteriorating with each song. The muscles in his throat were fatiguing faster than usual. The notes that should have been easy were requiring maximum effort. By the time they reached the midpoint of the show, Jon was compensating heavily, letting Richie Sambora's guitar and the backing vocals carry more weight. But the audience seemed happy. They were singing, dancing, living the Bon Jovi experience they had paid for. Then came the moment every Bon Jovi concert builds toward. The moment Jon could not avoid, could not skip, could not outsource. "Livin' on a Prayer." The opening keyboard notes triggered the Pavlovian response. 80,000 people rose to their feet. The anticipation was physical, electric. This was what they had come for. This was the song that defined Jon Bon Jovi, the anthem that had survived decades and remained cultural currency. No matter how many times they had heard it, no matter how predictable the moment, it still delivered transcendent communal joy. Jon began the first verse. "Tommy used to work on the docks. Union's been on strike." His voice was already showing severe strain, but the crowd singing covered it. Gina works the diner all day, working for her man. The verse continued, Jon pushing through on momentum and muscle memory. Then came the chorus, the moment of truth. Whoa, we're halfway there. Jon's voice cracked visibly on the high note, the sound distorting through the speakers. The crowd sang louder, compensating. Whoa, living on a prayer. Jon attempted the second whoa, and the sound that emerged was not singing. It was a strained rasp, barely melodic, painful to produce and painful to hear. Jon stopped singing. His hand went to his throat instinctively. The band kept playing, confused. The crowd kept singing, their voices filling the void where Jon's should have been. For maybe 10 seconds, Jon Bon Jovi stood silent on the Madison Square Garden stage, while 80,000 people sang his song without him. Then he tried again. Take my hand, we'll make it, I swear. The line came out as half whisper, half croak. There was no power, no pitch, no resonance. Just the desperate attempt of damaged vocal cords to produce sound they could no longer create. That was when the stadium began to change. The singing grew quieter. People in the front rows could see Jon's face, could see the strain and the fear and the terrible awareness that something was wrong beyond the usual struggles. They stopped singing, watching instead. A woman in the third row later posted on social media that she saw Jon's eyes welling with tears, saw him mouth, "I'm sorry," to the section closest to him. Her post went viral, capturing the intimacy of catastrophe witnessed by thousands. The silence spread backward through the crowd like a wave, row by row, section by section. Within 30 seconds, most of Madison Square Garden had fallen silent, still on their feet, but no longer singing, just watching Jon Bon Jovi struggle and fail to sing the song that had defined his career. Some people were crying. Others stood in shock, phones still raised to record, but hands trembling. A teenage girl who had come to her first Bon Jovi concert with her mother, who had grown up hearing these songs in the car and around the house, would later describe the moment as watching something sacred break in real time. The energy in the room had transformed completely. What had been celebration became wake. What had been communal joy became shared grief. The fans realized they were not just watching a bad performance. They were witnessing an ending, participating in a moment that would mark a before and after in rock history. Jon knew. He knew in that moment that something had broken beyond repair. This was not just a bad night. This was not vocal fatigue or poor technique. This was the end. He could feel it in his throat, could hear it in the absence of sound, could see it in the faces of the people in the front rows, their expressions shifting from excitement to concern to something approaching grief. He finished the song, or rather he performed the motions of finishing while the audience sang for him and the band played on. His voice contributed almost nothing to the final choruses. He raised his arms, conducting the crowd, letting them believe they were helping rather than replacing him. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous but strange, enthusiastic but tinged with uncertainty. Everyone had just witnessed something, but they were not yet sure what it meant. Jon said, "Thank you, New York," and walked off stage. The band looked at each other confused. This was only 2/3 through the set list. Jon never walked off mid-show. Backstage, Jon collapsed into a chair in his dressing room. His hands were shaking. His throat felt like it was closing. The vocal coach and tour manager rushed in, asking questions, offering water, suggesting solutions. Jon just shook his hand. "It's gone," he said, his speaking voice now also raspy and weak. "It's actually gone." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he meant. This was not a temporary problem that could be fixed with rest or tea or technique. This was the catastrophic failure everyone had feared, but hoped would never come. Jon put his head in his hands, and for the first time in his professional career, he cried in front of his team. Not from pain, though his throat was on fire, from the realization that his identity, the thing that had separated him from every other person with dreams and ambition, had just died in front of 80,000 witnesses. Richie Sambora came into the dressing room, guitar still strapped to his back. He and Jon had been partners for over 30 years. Richie had watched Jon's voice decline, had helped arrange songs to accommodate the limitations, had picked up slack with his guitar when the vocals faltered. But even Richie was shaken by what had just happened on stage. "Brother?" he said quietly, and Jon looked up, his face wet with tears. They did not need to say more. Both understood that something fundamental had ended. The show was suspended for 20 minutes while the tour manager addressed the crowd, explaining that Jon was experiencing vocal difficulties and needed a brief break. The audience waited, uncertain. Some people began leaving, sensing the show was over. Others stayed, hoping for a miracle. Jon tried. He went back on stage and attempted 3 more songs, but it was hopeless. His voice could not sustain even simple melodies. The high notes were completely inaccessible. Even the talking sections were strained. After struggling through Wanted, Dead or Alive, Jon addressed the crowd directly. "I'm sorry," he said, his damaged voice barely carrying over the sound system. "I can't give you what you deserve tonight. Thank you for understanding." He left the stage for the final time. The lights came up. 80,000 people filed out of Madison Square Garden, having witnessed the death of a voice, the end of an era. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Video from the show went viral within hours. Multiple angles from different sections of Madison Square Garden showed the same devastating moment. Jon attempting the high note, his voice breaking completely, the crowd falling silent in waves as they realized what they were witnessing. Music websites published articles with titles like "Jon Bon Jovi's voice fails during MSG show" and "Bon Jovi concert ends early due to vocal problems." The comment sections filled with debate, sympathy, criticism, and heartbreak. Fans who had been at the show posted their reactions online, ranging from sympathetic to devastated. "I've been a fan for 30 years, one person wrote on a Bon Jovi message board. "I've seen them 23 times. I've never seen him struggle like that. It was heartbreaking to watch. I cried in my car for 20 minutes after leaving the garden." Another fan posted a video taken from the floor section, showing Jon's face in close-up during the failed high note, his expression revealing the exact moment he realized what was happening. The video accumulated millions of views within days, becoming a cultural moment, a shared reference point for the end of an era. The music press was respectful but honest. Rolling Stone published a piece titled, "The Night Jon Bon Jovi's Voice Finally Gave Out," detailing the history of his vocal decline and the inevitability of what had happened at Madison Square Garden. Industry insiders who had worked with Jon over the years gave anonymous quotes about his determination to keep performing despite medical advice to stop, about the pressure of touring commitments and fan expectations, about the impossible choice between preserving his voice and maintaining his career. Jon Bon Jovi saw doctors the next morning. The diagnosis confirmed what he already knew. His vocal cords were severely damaged, worse than previous examinations had revealed. Years of performing through injury had created permanent scarring. The flexibility needed for his signature high notes was gone. The power that had carried his voice over stadium noise was depleted. Recovery was possible to a degree. With months of complete vocal rest, followed by extensive therapy, Jon might regain some function, but he would never sound like he did in his prime. The voice that had sung Livin' on a Prayer on that first recording in 1986 was gone forever. What remained was a damaged instrument that could approximate singing with significant limitations. Jon canceled the remaining tour dates. The official announcement cited vocal issues requiring medical attention and rest. Fans understood this was not temporary. This was not laryngitis or exhaustion. This was the inevitable result of decades of wear on an instrument that had finally, irrevocably broken. The months that followed were the darkest of Jon's professional life. He could not speak above a whisper for weeks. When he finally regained the ability to talk normally, his singing voice remained fractured and weak. Therapy helped, but progress was incremental and frustrating. The effortless power of his youth was gone. What replaced it was a careful, managed approach to vocal production that required constant attention and delivered inconsistent results. Jon faced the question he had been avoiding for years. Was his career over? Could he continue as a performer with a voice that could no longer perform the songs people expected? Was there any point in being Jon Bon Jovi if he could not sing like Jon Bon Jovi? His wife, Dorothea, his anchor through decades of fame and struggle, gave him perspective. "The voice was the gift," she told him, "but the songs are bigger than your voice. The connection you created with people is bigger than how high you can sing. You have to decide if performing still matters to you, even if it's different than before." Jon decided to continue, but it would be on new terms, with full acknowledgement of his limitations. When Bon Jovi returned to touring in 2018, Jon was honest with audiences. "My voice is not what it was," he would say before shows. "I need your help tonight." The crowds understood. They sang louder. They accepted the modified keys and simplified arrangements. They celebrated what remained rather than mourning what was lost. But everyone knew that April 15, 2017 was the dividing line. Before Madison Square Garden, there was hope that Jon's vocal issues were temporary or manageable. After that night, there was acceptance of permanent loss. The 80,000 fans who were there and the millions who watched the videos later witnessed the exact moment when Jon Bon Jovi's voice broke forever. The cruel irony was not lost on Jon. He had spent decades singing about holding on, about faith, about making it through hard times. "Livin' on a prayer, take my hand, we'll make it, I swear." And it was that exact song, that anthem of perseverance, that became the moment of his greatest public failure. The note he could no longer hit was in the song that defined him, a permanent reminder of what he had lost. Today, Jon Bon Jovi is in his 60s. He still performs, but differently. The set lists are carefully managed to avoid his most vocally demanding songs. The keys are lowered. The audience participation is essential rather than optional. Concert reviews note his limitations, but generally praise his determination to continue. He is no longer judged against his peak, but against the reality of what time and damage have left him. The voice is gone. That is simply a fact. The power, the range, the effortless high notes that made him one of rock's most distinctive singers, all of it disappeared that night in Madison Square Garden and never returned. What replaced it is a more fragile instrument, carefully guarded, frequently failing, dependent on accommodation and acceptance. But the songs remain. the connection remains. The people who were in Madison Square Garden that night, who witnessed the breaking of the voice, many of them still attend shows. They sing louder now, carrying the parts Jon can no longer reach. They understand that they are participating in an act of collective memory, keeping alive songs that matter to them even though the person who wrote them can no longer fully perform them. Jon has made peace with it, mostly. There are still moments of grief, flashes of anger at his body's betrayal, frustration with limitations. But he has learned to find value in what remains rather than dwelling on what is lost. The voice is gone. The music continues. That has to be enough. The legacy of April 15, 2017 is complicated. For some fans, it was a tragedy, the death of something irreplaceable. For others, it was a lesson in persistence, in continuing despite loss, in finding new ways to create meaning when the old ways fail. For Jon himself, it was the night he stopped being the person he had been and began learning to be someone else, someone defined not by perfect vocal performance, but by the determination to keep showing up, even when showing up meant revealing limitation and loss. 80,000 people were there. They realized in that moment that Jon Bon Jovi's voice was gone forever. What they did not realize, what took months and years to understand, was that the loss of the voice was not the end of the story. It was a transformation, painful and public, from artist at his peak to artist in decline, to artist who continues anyway, finding different kinds of value in a career that can no longer deliver what it once did. The night the voice died, something else was born. Not better, not equal, but different. A Jon Bon Jovi who could no longer hide behind power and range, who had to face his audience with limitations exposed, who had to find meaning in effort rather than effortlessness. Whether that transformation was worth the cost is a question Jon still wrestles with. But the 80,000 fans who were there, who witnessed the breaking, many of them would say yes, because they learned that night that the music was never just about the voice. It was about what the voice represented, the courage to keep singing, even when the song becomes too hard to sing.